My husband said, "I love your sister and I'm happy with her." He left and took all our savings. I slept alone in my car, but a lawyer called me. "Ma'am, your father has passed away and left you $130 million. Good day, dear listeners. It's Maria again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to think I had everything. A house with a wraparound porch in suburban Columbus, Ohio. A marriage that looked from the outside like something out of a catalog. Daniel with his easy smile and broad shoulders. Me in the kitchen on Sunday mornings making the coffee he liked too strong. We'd been together 11 years, married for 8. We had a dog named Biscuit who slept at the foot of the bed, and a savings account we had built together, dollar by dollar, through 2 recessions and 1 miscarriage we never really talked about after the first month. I was a high school English teacher. I drove a sensible Honda. I read on weekends and called my mother every Thursday. My life was ordinary in the way that only feels like a gift once it's gone. My sister Megan was 3 years younger and had always been the prettier one, not just by my own insecure judgment, but by the verdict of every room she walked into. She had our father's green eyes and our mother's cheekbones and a laugh that made people lean toward her like flowers toward a window. I loved her. I want to be honest about that because it matters. I genuinely, completely loved my sister. She had gone through a rough divorce 2 years prior, and Daniel, kind, generous, community-minded Daniel, had suggested she stay with us for a few months while she got back on her feet. I agreed without hesitation. That was in January. The first sign was so small I almost feel foolish saying it out loud now. It was a Tuesday in March, a cold one, the kind where the sky sits low and gray over everything. I came home from school earlier than expected. A faculty meeting had been canceled, and found them in the kitchen together. Nothing scandalous. They were just laughing. Daniel had his hand on the counter near Megan's, not touching, just near. And when I walked in, the laughter stopped a half second too quickly. I told myself, "You're imagining things." I told myself that for 4 months. In April, I noticed Daniel had started showering before dinner, which he had never done in 8 years of marriage. In May, he began leaving his phone face down on tables. In June, he stopped reaching for my hand during movies. These were individually meaningless. Collectively, they formed a shape I refused to name. Megan, for her part, became slightly more formal with me, more careful. She complimented my cooking in a way that felt rehearsed. She hugged me a beat too long when she arrived and a beat too quickly when she left. I should have trusted my instincts. Every woman I've known who has been through this says the same thing afterward. I knew. I just didn't want to know. By mid-July, our savings account had $47,000 in it. We had built that money together, my teacher's salary and his project management income, set aside through 15 years of combined adult life. It was supposed to be a down payment on a lake house upstate, a dream we had talked about since our honeymoon. I remember the exact night it ended. It was a Wednesday. A warm evening in late July, the windows open, the sound of the neighbor's sprinklers running somewhere outside. I had made pasta. The table was set. Daniel came in from the garage where he'd supposedly been on a phone call, sat down across from me, and folded his hands on the table like a man about to deliver a business presentation. He looked at me directly. That, somehow, was the worst part. "Claire," he said, "I'm in love with Megan. I have been for months. I'm not going to lie to you anymore." The sprinklers kept running. Biscuit was sleeping in the hallway. "We're happy together," he continued, as though happiness were a defense. "I know this is painful. I'm sorry. But I think you deserve the truth." I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I sat very still and felt the table, solid and wooden, under my fingertips, and I thought, this is real. I was grounding myself to the physical world because my internal world had just been detonated. I asked him to leave. He did, that night, with 2 large duffel bags he had already packed. Megan's things were gone from the guest room. They had planned this. They had planned it, and I had set the table and made pasta and not known a thing. I sat in the kitchen until midnight. Then I checked our joint savings account from my phone. The balance was $214. I drove to the parking lot of a Walgreens 3 blocks away and sat in my car because I could not be in that house alone. I pulled my jacket around me and watched a moth hit the orange light above the entrance over and over, and I thought, what do I do now? My phone buzzed, an unknown number, Columbus area code. I almost didn't answer. I answered on the 4th buzz, the way you answer things you're not ready for because not answering feels worse. Is this Claire Hargrove Whitmore? A man's voice, measured and professional, with the careful cadence of someone delivering important information for a living. This is Claire Whitmore, I said automatically. Ms. Whitmore, my name is Gerald Lawson. I'm a senior partner at Lawson & Associates, Estate Law. I'm calling regarding Robert Hargrove. I'm very sorry to inform you. Your father passed away this evening at Columbus Regional Hospital. He had a cardiac event. It was peaceful, from what the attending physician indicated. My father, Robert Hargrove, the man I had not spoken to in 6 years, the man who had walked out of our family when I was 19 and Megan was 16, who had built a second life and a significant business in real estate and private equity, who had sent birthday cards for 2 years and then stopped, who existed in my mind as something between a wound and an abstraction. Ms. Whitmore, are you there? Yes, I said. I'm here. Your father left a will. You are the sole named beneficiary of his estate. I understand this may come as a shock. The estate has been independently valued at approximately $130 million. I'd like to schedule a meeting as soon as possible. There are time-sensitive documents to discuss. I sat in that Walgreens parking lot for a very long time after I hung up. The math of that night was almost impossible to hold in my head simultaneously. $214 in my bank account, $130 million in a will, a husband who was gone, a sister who had taken him, a father who had died alone and left everything to the daughter he had abandoned. I slept in the car. The back seat was cramped, and I woke up twice, cold, and had to remind myself where I was and why. A security guard knocked on the window at 6 a.m., and I drove home with my face feeling tight from crying I didn't fully remember doing. The house looked different in the morning light. Smaller, somehow. I walked through the rooms and took inventory the way you do after a storm, checking what the damage was. His side of the closet, empty. His toiletries, gone. His laptop, his external hard drive. The good camera we bought for our 10th anniversary, all gone. But the mortgage was in both our names. The car was in mine. And the joint account, I called the bank that morning and asked for a full transaction history. He had been moving money for 11 days. Small transfers, $1,500 here, $3,000 there, to an account I didn't recognize. Nothing large enough to trigger an automatic alert. 11 days of quiet, methodical theft. The account had held $47,400 before he began. He had left $214, which I was certain was deliberate. Enough that it wasn't technically zero. Was this planned for weeks? Had Megan helped him structure it? I sat at the kitchen table with a notepad and wrote down everything I knew in columns, the way I used to teach my students to organize an argument. Column 1, what I had lost. Column 2, what I still had. Column 3, what I needed to find out. Column 2 was the one that steadied me. I still had the house, at least temporarily. I still had my job. I still had my name on the car. And I had. And this felt almost obscene given the night I'd just had. A pending inheritance of $130 million from a father who had been a stranger for 6 years. I also had my dignity. Daniel had counted on me falling apart. I could see it in the way he had planned the conversation, the way he'd packed in advance, the way he had waited until the money was moved before saying a word. He had built the architecture of my destruction very carefully. He expected rubble. What he didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that I had spent 8 years watching him manage projects, listening to him talk about how you move a large problem from an obstacle into a solved state. I had learned more than he realized. I called my friend Rachel Keene the next morning. Rachel was a paralegal at a family law firm downtown, and the closest thing I had to a person who understood both the emotional and legal dimensions of what had happened. She arrived within the hour, brought coffee and a legal pad, and did not hug me and say, "I'm so sorry," the way I feared she would. She sat down, looked at the transaction history I'd printed, and said, "Okay, this is financial misconduct during the marriage. We document everything and we move fast." That was the sentence that turned something over in me. I was afraid. I want to be honest about that too. I was terrified of the courts, of confronting them, of the size of what had happened. But fear, I was learning, doesn't have to be the end of a sentence. It can be the beginning of one. I had 2 calls to make. One to Gerald Lawson to understand exactly what I stood to inherit and when, and one to a divorce attorney. I made both before noon. My first plan was simple. Say nothing to Daniel or Megan about the inheritance. Not yet. Let them believe I was broken. Let them believe the $214 was the whole story. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let someone underestimate you. Gerald Lawson's office was on the 14th floor of a glass building on Broad Street, the kind of office that whispers old money without saying a word out loud. Dark wood, framed diplomas, a receptionist who offered water in a real glass. I came in on a Friday morning in a blazer I'd ironed the night before, my notepad in my bag, my expression as neutral as I could manage. Gerald was in his early 60s, silver-haired, with reading glasses he wore low on his nose, and a manner so methodical it was actually calming. He walked me through my father's estate with the precision of a man who had done this many times and understood it carried weight. Robert Hargrove had built his fortune in commercial real estate, properties across Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky, 3 office parks, a hotel stake, and a series of private equity investments. The estate had been structured cleanly, the will revised 14 months ago. Gerald showed me the revision date without my asking, and I understood why immediately. My father had known he was ill. He'd had a heart condition for over a year. He had spent that year putting his affairs in precise order, and he had left everything to me, not to Megan, to me specifically by name, with a notation in the supplementary letter that I was not required to read but was offered. I read it. "Claire, I know I have no right to ask your forgiveness. I spent too long being a coward and not enough time being your father. I hope this doesn't feel like I'm trying to buy something that isn't for sale. It isn't that. You were always the one who didn't need me, and I think I took that as permission to leave. I was wrong. Dad." I folded the letter and put it in my bag and did not cry in Gerald Lawson's office. The practical matters. The estate would go through probate, which in Ohio typically takes 4 to 6 months. In the meantime, I was authorized as executor, which gave me access to administrative documents and, critically, the ability to retain counsel on behalf of the estate. Gerald's firm would handle probate. I retained Rachel's firm for the divorce. My divorce attorney was a woman named Patricia Osei, 47 years old, with the efficient intensity of someone who had seen every version of this particular story and maintained her outrage nonetheless. She reviewed the bank transaction history within 48 hours and called me back with a word I had been waiting to hear: actionable. The transfers were made 11 days before he filed for divorce, she said. Ohio is an equitable distribution state. Assets moved during the marriage, especially in anticipation of divorce proceedings, can be considered dissipated marital assets. We can seek recovery. Can we get all of it back? We can make a compelling case. But Claire, I need to ask, do you have documentation of his relationship with your sister? Timeline, texts, anything? I told her I was working on it. That was not entirely true, but it would be. Here is where I have to be careful about what I say, because I want to be clear that I did not do anything illegal. What I did was retrieve something that had always been mine. 3 years prior, Daniel and I had set up a shared cloud account for household documents, insurance policies, appliance warranties, tax records. He had forgotten it existed, or he had assumed that in the chaos of his departure, I would forget too. I logged in. The account contained 4 years of automatic phone backups. His and mine synced because we had set it up together on a lazy Sunday afternoon and never properly separated the accounts afterward. His messages were there. Not all of them. He had been careful with iMessage, which encrypts, but his texts to Megan's number, which she had saved under a contact name that I recognized as a college friend of his, were backed up across a 40-week period. I read them for 3 hours at the kitchen table with the lights off, because somehow the dark felt appropriate. They had started in October, the previous October, 9 months ago. What I had taken as a few months of whatever this was had been the better part of a year. The messages were explicit enough in their emotional content to be devastating, and careful enough in certain other ways to suggest he had some awareness, even then, that digital evidence existed. But there was enough. There was a message from January in which Daniel wrote, "I told her she can stay as long as she needs to. She doesn't know anything." And Megan's response, "I feel terrible, but I also don't." Does that make sense? It made sense. I understood it completely. I forwarded the relevant screenshots to Patricia Osei with a note. "This is your documentation of the timeline." Then I closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a long time. I was past the point where I could pretend this might resolve quietly. The evidence was real. The legal process had begun. I had retained counsel. I had visited my father's estate attorney, and I had documented the financial misconduct. I had crossed the line from victim to participant in my own story. There was no going back. And for the first time since that Wednesday evening and the 2 quickly folded hands and the sprinklers running outside, I didn't want to. Patricia filed the initial divorce petition on a Tuesday morning in August, 3 weeks after that parking lot phone call. In Ohio, divorce filings are public record. I knew Daniel would find out the same day. He had a Google alert on his name, I remembered. Something he'd set up years ago for professional reasons. But even knowing that, I was not prepared for how fast the retaliation came. He called me at 4:17 that afternoon. "What are you doing?" He didn't say hello. His voice was tight in a way I had never heard before, stripped of the easy confidence that had always been his default register. "You filed? Really, Claire? After everything?" "After everything," I said. "Yes. I'm not doing this through lawyers. This is insane. We can talk like adults. Come over. Megan and I are at her apartment. Just come over and let's talk this through without Daniel." I kept my voice even. I had rehearsed this. "My attorney has advised me not to have unmediated conversations about the divorce. Please direct everything to Patricia Osei at..." He hung up. Megan called 20 minutes later. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was 6 minutes long, which told me something about her emotional state. I transcribed key portions and sent it to Patricia, because anything they said could be relevant to demonstrating their awareness of the financial misconduct. But the real escalation came 4 days later. I was in the grocery store, of all places, the mundane middle of a produce section, when I turned around and found Daniel standing 6 feet away from me, with the fixed expression of a man who had rehearsed what he intended to say and was now deploying it. "I know about the inheritance," he said. I felt the floor go still under my feet. I hadn't told him. I hadn't told anyone except Rachel and Patricia and Gerald Lawson. "I don't know what you're referring to," I said. "Your father's estate. $130 million. He said the number quietly, as though we were discussing weather. "Claire, I want you to understand something. We were married for 8 years. In Ohio, marital assets include assets acquired during the marriage under certain..." "I know Ohio family law," I said. "My attorney knows Ohio family law." "It would be in everyone's interest to settle this privately," he said, "before the courts get involved in asset division, before things get complicated." Before things get complicated. 8 years of marriage, and that was the language. "I'm aware of your interest," I said. "You should direct that awareness to Patricia Osei's office." I left my cart in the aisle and walked out of the store. My hands were shaking in the car, but not from fear, or not only from fear. It was the kind of trembling that comes when adrenaline has nowhere to go. He had found out about the inheritance. The question was how. The estate filing was not yet public in a searchable way, which meant either someone at Gerald's office had been indiscreet, or, more likely, Megan had contacts, or Daniel had simply hired someone to look into my father's estate the moment he heard Robert Hargrove had died, through whatever mutual acquaintance carries that kind of news. I called Patricia from the parking lot. "He knows," I said. "About the inheritance or about the evidence?" "The inheritance. He approached me in person. I believe he's planning to argue that any estate assets are divisible." "They're not," she said, with a flatness that was deeply reassuring. "Inheritances in Ohio are separate property, even during marriage. He has no claim. But Claire, him approaching you directly after a petition has been filed is problematic for him, not for you. I'm noting this for the record. Do you have any witnesses?" I didn't. But the grocery store had cameras. Patricia sent a formal cease and desist letter to Daniel's newly retained attorney that week, warning against any further direct contact with me regarding the divorce proceedings. 2 days after that, we received a response from his attorney. Aggressive, accusatory, claiming that my petition was retaliatory, that the bank transfers had been made with my implicit knowledge, and containing, buried in the 3rd paragraph, a threat. Our client retains documentary evidence regarding Ms. Whitmore's conduct during the marriage that may be relevant to character assessments. It was a bluff. I had been faithful. I had been, if anything, so thoroughly invested in the marriage that I had ignored every signal of its disintegration. But the threat was real enough to make me cold for an hour. Then Patricia called to tell me Daniel's attorney had filed a motion to include the inheritance in asset discoveries, and that she had already prepared the response, which cited the Ohio statute precisely, along with 3 precedent cases. "He's not winning this," she said. "He's stalling." The motion was denied 2 weeks later. That was when they stopped pushing, at least for a while, not because they had given up. I knew better than that. But because they had tested the structure I had built and found it solid, and they needed to regroup. I took 4 days off from everything. I drove 3 hours north to a cabin my coworker let me borrow on the shore of Lake Erie. I walked on the rocky beach in the mornings and read novels in the afternoon and slept 9 hours each night for the first time since July. On the last morning, I sat on the cabin's small dock and watched the sun come up over the water and thought about my father, who had been a coward, and then, at the end, tried in the only way he had left to make it right. I thought about what I owed him. I thought, I'm going to be okay. Not because of the money, because I was still standing. They tried kindness next, which was, in its way, more unsettling than the confrontation in the grocery store. It was a Saturday afternoon in September, 2 weeks after I'd returned from the lake, and I was in the backyard pulling up the dead annuals from the flower bed along the fence, the ones I'd planted in May, back when I still thought I was building something, when my phone rang. It was Megan. I stood in the garden with dirt on my gloves and looked at her name on the screen. Why now? What do they want from this? I answered. Claire. Her voice was soft. The version of Megan I remembered from childhood, before the hard edges that came with her divorce, before whatever this past year had made her. I wanted to hear your voice. I've been thinking about you. Okay, I said. I know you're angry. You have every right to be. I'm not calling to argue. I'm calling because you're my sister, and I miss you, and I don't want this to destroy our family any more than it already. Megan, I said, please don't. A pause. Don't what? Don't call me and speak softly and tell me you miss me while your boyfriend, my husband, is filing legal counterclaims through his attorney. Don't do the soft voice if the strategy hasn't changed. Another pause, longer this time. This isn't a strategy, Claire. I believe you mean it right now, I said. I don't think you're entirely performing, but I also think you're calling me the same week his attorney sent a letter suggesting I have character deficiencies, and I think those two things are connected. So I'm going to go back to my garden now, and I'm going to ask you to please communicate through the legal process we've both agreed to. I hung up. I stood in the garden for a moment, gloves still on, the afternoon light going gold through the maple at the back of the yard. I felt, and I want to be precise about this, almost nothing. Not the cold nothing of numbness or shock, but the clean nothing of someone who has moved past the place where a particular pain can reach. The call had not made me want to reconsider. It had not made me miss her, not in the old way. It had made me a little sad, in the abstract way you feel sad about something that has already happened and cannot be changed. That was important information about where I was. Daniel sent a text message the following Thursday. Not about the divorce, at least not directly. He texted to ask if I still had the external hard drive he used to store job site photos because he needed it for a client. It was such an ordinary request, so perfectly calibrated to invoke the mechanical habits of a shared life, that for 3 seconds I almost just answered it the way I would have a year ago. No, I haven't seen it. Did you check the office closet? Then I read it again and forwarded it to Patricia as potential harassment. She confirmed. Technically permissible, practically imprudent on his part. She logged it. I think they expected me to be oscillating. Angry one week, tearful the next, inconsistent in my resolve. That's what collapse looks like from the outside, and it's what they had planned for. What they were encountering instead was a woman who was, week by week, becoming more settled in her purpose. Not harder exactly, more certain. The social support I found was not what I expected. Rachel was my anchor, practical, legally minded, the friend who would sit across a table from me and help me think rather than simply validate. But there was also a women's support group that Patricia had mentioned, offhandedly at the end of one of our meetings, a Thursday evening gathering at a community center on the Near East Side, organized by a family counseling nonprofit. Not therapy exactly, more like a room where women in the middle of difficult family legal situations could speak without performing. I went once thinking I would hate it. I went back the next 3 Thursdays in a row. There was a woman named Dorothea, in her early 60s, who'd been through a contested estate dispute with her siblings and emerged on the other side of it with both her sanity and her half of the estate intact. She had a way of listening that made you feel simultaneously seen and less alone in your particular absurdity. There was a younger woman, Priya, who was in a custody dispute so complicated it made my situation feel linear, who nonetheless laughed frequently and with what appeared to be genuine humor. "The thing they count on," Dorothea said one evening, to the room in general but in a way that landed on me, "is that you'll exhaust yourself trying to make sense of their behavior. At some point, you stop asking why and start asking what's next." I wrote that down. Stop asking why. Start asking what's next. It wasn't that I stopped caring about the betrayal. I cared. I think I will always carry some form of that particular scar. But I stopped letting the question of why did they do this to me occupy the room that needed to be occupied by what do I do about it. That shift was quiet and gradual, and it was, I think, the most important thing that happened to me that September. I was ready for whatever came next. They came to the house on a Sunday in October. I had not invited them. I had not been warned. I pulled into my own driveway at 2 p.m., returning from the grocery store, and found Daniel's black Accord parked at the curb with both of them inside it. They got out as I turned off my engine, Megan in a camel-colored coat I had never seen before, Daniel in the navy jacket he wore when he wanted to appear reasonable. Why here? Why now? Why together? I sat in my car for a moment before getting out. I texted Rachel. "They're outside my house. I'm going to talk to them, logging this timestamp." She responded within seconds. "Don't go inside with them. Stay outside. Stay visible. Call me if it escalates." I got out of the car. "We should talk," Daniel said. No hello. He had his hands in his jacket pockets, a posture that managed to look both casual and blocked. Just the three of us, privately. "We are outside," I said. "This is about as private as it gets." Megan stepped forward. She had been crying recently. The particular redness around her eyes that I had seen so many times in childhood and could not misread. She said, "Claire, please, can't this be over? We're destroying each other." "The divorce petition was filed 2 months ago," I said. "I've been in communication with your attorney. There's a process. We're in it." "The process," Daniel said, and his tone shifted. Not much, but enough, the way a drop in temperature shifts before a front moves in. "The process that you're funding with an inheritance that came from a man who abandoned both of you. You know what I think about that?" "I don't need you to have an opinion about my father," I said. "I think it's convenient," he continued, as though I hadn't spoken. "I think it's very convenient that suddenly you have legal resources and you're playing hardball when 6 months ago you were—" "Daniel." I kept my voice flat. "What do you want?" He looked at me for a moment, and I watched him recalibrate. The aggression dropped back down. He became, in a visible instant, the reasonable version he'd arrived intending to be. "I want us to settle," he said. "Privately, out of court. I'm not asking for anything related to your inheritance. I understand the law on that. I'm asking for a fair split of marital assets, some acknowledgement that the marriage ending wasn't entirely, 'You moved $47,000 from our joint account over 11 days, I said. "My attorney has documentation. That was—" He stopped, started again. "That was money I contributed proportionally over years. I wasn't doing anything wrong." "Patricia Osei is aware of your interpretation," I said. "You're welcome to have your attorney discuss it with her." Megan moved then, the way she used to move when we were children and she wanted something she wasn't going to ask for directly. A slight step to the side, a shift in her physical space, a softening. "Claire, I know I hurt you. I know there's nothing I can say that makes that okay, but you and I are sisters. We grew up together. Our mom is still alive. Are we really going to do this? Courtrooms, attorneys, for years? Over a man?" It was, I had to give her credit, extremely well targeted, because she was right about part of it. We had grown up together. I had held her hair back when she was sick at 17. I had driven 5 hours to be with her on the day her divorce was finalized. There was real history between us, and she was using it the way a lockpick uses the structure of a lock, not breaking it, just applying pressure to exactly the right place. "Megan," I said, "I love you. I want to be very clear about that. I love you and I am devastated by what happened. But what you're asking me to do is to let Daniel keep money he took illegally, to abandon a legal process that is functioning correctly, and to do it because you're reminding me that we are family. That is not a compromise. That is capitulation dressed in sentiment." She blinked. Daniel's jaw tightened. "This is," he started, and the reasonable voice cracked, just barely at the edge. "This is not who you are, Claire. You're not someone who weaponizes lawyers and plays games with money. That's not—" "I'm someone whose husband stole from her and whose sister helped him do it," I said. "I'm someone who is now using the legal system exactly the way it is designed to be used. I'm sorry if that doesn't match the version of me you were expecting." There was a pause. 10 seconds, maybe 15, that felt architectural. "You'll regret this," Daniel said. Not a threat exactly. The statement of a man who has run out of levers and is not ready to admit it. They left. I went inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and let myself shake for a few minutes because the adrenaline had to go somewhere. My hands were cold. My throat was tight. But here is what I knew. As I sat there in the quiet of my house, with Biscuit pressing his warm weight against my feet, I was afraid, and the fear was real, and it did not change a single thing about what I intended to do. If anything, it clarified it. Every time they pushed, I understood more clearly what I was protecting and why. I texted Rachel. "They've gone." I held the line. "See you Thursday." The mediation session was scheduled for a Wednesday in November in a conference room at a neutral attorney's office in the short north. Patricia had recommended it as a required step before the court date. Ohio encourages mediation in contested divorces. I had agreed because Patricia told me to, and because I had, by that point, something Daniel and Megan did not, a complete picture. I arrived 12 minutes early. Patricia was already there, her leather folder open, 2 printed copies of a document I had not yet seen face to face, but had reviewed the night before, until 1 a.m. Daniel arrived with his attorney, a man named Garrett Hale, who had the aggressive friendliness of someone used to managing rooms. He shook hands with the mediator, nodded at Patricia, and briefly, almost imperceptibly, looked past me, as though I were a detail he was factoring rather than a person he was addressing. Megan was not present. She had no legal role in the divorce proceedings. But I knew, as certainly as I knew anything, that she had spent the previous evening on the phone with Daniel, walking through whatever strategy they had assembled. We sat down. The mediator, a calm woman named Sandra, laid out the agenda. The primary disputes, the $46,986 in transferred marital funds, the house valuation, and Daniel's counterclaim, which had been amended twice, now arguing that my alleged emotional withdrawal during the marriage had contributed to its breakdown and should be considered an asset distribution. Patricia let Sandra finish. Then she opened her folder. "We'd like to introduce several items into the mediation record," she said, in the tone of someone reading a grocery list. "First, the bank transaction history documenting 11 days of transfers from the joint account prior to the separation, totaling $46,986. Second, a sworn affidavit from the bank's compliance department confirming these transfers were made unilaterally by Daniel Whitmore, without co-authorization. Third, we've seen the bank records," Garrett said. "My client has explained." Third, Patricia continued, without inflection, text message documentation, legally obtained from a shared cloud backup account, establishing that the emotional relationship between Daniel Whitmore and Megan Hargrove began in October of the previous year, 10 months prior to the separation, and 9 months prior to Megan Hargrove taking up residence in the marital home. The room went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. I watched Daniel's face. I had wondered, in the weeks leading up to this, how I would feel seeing him across a table like this. Whether I would feel grief or rage or the pull of old familiarity. What I felt was clarity. The same clarity you feel when you've been looking at something in bad light for a long time and someone finally turns on the lamp. He had not known about the cloud backup. I could see it in the way the color shifted at the line of his jaw. Fourth, Patricia said, financial records obtained through discovery showing that $12,000 of the transferred marital funds were deposited into an account belonging to Megan Hargrove within 3 weeks of the transfer. We have the deposit records. That I had not known. Patricia had obtained it through the discovery process, and she had not told me until the previous evening because she had wanted to make sure the documentation was airtight before I knew. He had given Megan the money, our money. He had funneled $12,000 of what we built together into her account. Garrett Hale leaned toward Daniel, and they had a rapid, low exchange that the mediator politely ignored. "Ms. Whitmore," Sandra said, looking at me, "would you like to speak to any of—" "I would," I said. I had prepared a statement. I had written it at the kitchen table 3 days before, edited it twice, read it aloud to Rachel, who had suggested one change. It was 1 page, single-spaced, but when the moment came, I folded it closed. "Daniel," I said, "I spent 8 years building a life with you. I was faithful and present and, if anything, too trusting. You were having a relationship with my sister for 10 months while she lived in our home. You systematically transferred money from our joint account in the days before you told me the marriage was over. Some of that money went to her. I think you believed I would be too devastated or too disorganized or too financially depleted to respond coherently." He was looking at the table now. "I want the $46,986 returned in full. I want the house, which I will buy out at a fair assessment or sell with equitable division. I want you to withdraw the counterclaim about emotional withdrawal, which is both factually wrong and deeply insulting, and I want this finished." Garrett started to respond. Patricia held up one finger, a small, precise gesture, and said, "You should also be aware that the text message evidence, if entered into court, is likely to establish conduct that, while not legally considered in no-fault divorce states, does have implications for the dissipation claim. Your client transferred money during the marriage into the account of the person he was having an affair with. That is textbook dissipation under Ohio Revised Code 3105171. Our position is documented, and I am prepared to take it in front of a judge." Garrett asked for a recess. They were gone for 22 minutes. When they came back, Daniel had the look of a man who had finally understood the shape of what had happened to him. Not because someone had done something to him, but because he had built a house of bad decisions and was now standing inside it while the walls came down. He agreed to every term. I signed nothing that day. Patricia wanted it in a formal settlement agreement before any signatures. But I walked out of that conference room into the gray November afternoon, and I stood on the sidewalk and breathed cold air, and I thought, this is what it feels like. Not triumph, exactly. Something quieter. The satisfaction of a thing completed that needed to be completed. The settlement was finalized on December 19th, 6 days before Christmas. I sat in Patricia's office on a clear winter morning with weak sunlight coming through the tall windows, and I signed my name to a document that represented the legal conclusion of 8 years of marriage and 4 months of what I can only describe as the hardest work I have ever done. The terms, as agreed, Daniel returned $46,986 in full, transferred back to my sole account within 10 business days. The marital home was to be listed and sold, with proceeds split 60/40 in my favor, based on Patricia's successful argument regarding dissipation of marital assets. His counterclaim regarding my emotional withdrawal had been withdrawn without prejudice, which is the legal way of saying it vanished from the record. The divorce was granted on the grounds of irreconcilable differences. Patricia shook my hand when I stood up. She was not the kind of attorney who editorializes, but she said, "You were a good client. You stayed rational when it mattered." "I had good counsel," I said. Gerald Lawson's office had been working in parallel through those same months. The probate process, which he had estimated at 4 to 6 months, moved efficiently. My father had been meticulous about his estate planning, which turned out to be the final gift he could offer me. In February, 5 months after that parking lot phone call, the estate cleared probate. $131,412,000. The additional amount above the initial estimate came from the final valuation of one of the office park assets, which had been appraised conservatively and sold at a premium to a regional developer. I sat with Gerald in his office on that February afternoon, and he walked me through the transfer documents with the same methodical care he had shown from the beginning, and I understood slowly that this was real. My father, flawed, absent, cowardly, then desperate, had left me something that would allow me to choose every next thing with complete freedom. I had spent the months of the probate working with a financial advisor Gerald recommended, a woman named Constance Webb, who had the rare quality of explaining complex financial instruments without condescension. I was not reckless. I was not suddenly a different person with different values. I did not buy a yacht or move to a penthouse. What I did, I resigned from my teaching position in March, effective at the end of the school year, with genuine gratitude for 13 years in those classrooms and genuine knowledge that it was time to step out of the life that had been built around necessity. I set up a charitable foundation in my father's name, the Hargrove Education Foundation, with an endowment that would fund reading programs in underfunded Ohio school districts. It felt like the right use of a complicated inheritance. I bought a house, a smaller one than I expected to want, a craftsman bungalow in the short north neighborhood, 3 blocks from a coffee shop I'd always liked, with a garden in the back that needed work. Biscuit ran through every room the first day, confused and delighted. Now, Daniel and Megan. I was not present when Daniel discovered the full scope of what had happened. I didn't need to be. But Rachel, who had a knack for information, told me that he had understood sometime around the settlement finalization that his negotiating strategy had collapsed because he had fundamentally misread who I was. He had taken $46,986 from a woman he expected to be economically helpless, and that woman had retained excellent legal counsel and documented everything. He had also, somewhere in the chaos of the fall, lost his job. His firm had a conflict of interest policy regarding financial misconduct allegations, and the discovery documents, which had to be filed, were not private. A colleague saw them. The firm investigated. Daniel was let go in December, the same week we signed the settlement. He and Megan were living, last I heard, in a 2-bedroom rental in Whitehall. She had not found stable work. Their relationship, which had seemed so urgent and necessary that it justified every decision they had made, was, by all accounts, strained under the weight of the practical consequences of those decisions. I want to be honest. I did not celebrate that. I am not built for satisfaction at other people's suffering, even when they have earned it through their choices. What I felt when Rachel told me was something more like the recognition of cause and effect. Every action has weight. They had made choices with a particular weight. They were carrying it. The legal chapter was complete. The financial chapter was complete. I had walked into that grocery store confrontation with shaking hands and walked out of mediation into cold November air with something solid in my chest. No compromises, no half measures, no quiet acceptance of what they had assumed I would accept. I was done with that version of the story. The first summer of my new life, I planted a garden. Not the hurried, hopeful kind I had planted in the old house in May, the one I'd been pulling up dead from the earth when Megan called. This one I planned carefully over the winter, reading about soil and perennials and companion planting with the same attention I used to give to lesson plans. By June, the backyard of the craftsman bungalow was full of color: lavender along the fence, a climbing rose on the trellis, tomatoes in raised beds that I ate still warm from the vine. It was the small things that told me I had changed. I slept well. I cooked without occasion. I read on weekend afternoons without the low-grade anxiety that had been my ambient background for more of my marriage than I'd been willing to admit. I walked to the coffee shop 3 blocks over most mornings, a place called Acres, and sat at the same corner table and read or wrote in my journal, and the doing nothing felt for the first time in years like something I deserved. The Hargrove Education Foundation launched its first grant cycle in the fall, distributing $2.3 million across 14 school districts in Ohio, funding classroom libraries and literacy intervention programs. I was on the board. Gerald Lawson, it turned out, was an avid reader. We discovered this over coffee after one meeting and spent 40 minutes talking about a novel we had both read the previous month. He was a quiet, decent man, recently widowed. We began having coffee occasionally. It became something I looked forward to. I am not going to suggest I was not also, sometimes, sad. Grief doesn't organize itself neatly by category. I grieve the marriage, not Daniel specifically, but the life I had believed in, the future I had assumed was coming. I grieved the version of my sister that had existed before she made the choice that made all the subsequent choices inevitable. I called my mother more often. She was living in Dayton, 71 years old and sharp as a tack, and she said simply, "I always thought you were the steady one. I'm glad you stayed steady." Rachel and I had dinner every other Thursday. Dorothea from the support group had become a genuine friend. There is a particular honesty available between people who meet during the worst version of their lives that normal friendships have to earn over years. As for Megan and Daniel, Daniel had not found comparable work. The circumstances of his departure from his firm were not secret in the industry. Columbus is large, but the commercial construction world is smaller than it looks. He was consulting on smaller residential projects inconsistently. Megan had taken a retail position. The Whitehall apartment was, by every account I received, not a happy place. There had been a fight in the spring, the kind that becomes known through mutual acquaintances, over money and over the fact that the grand gesture had not led to the grand life. Over the specific cruelty of having sacrificed a sister and a stable future for something that turned out to be ordinary in its disappointments. When a thing is built on betrayal, it tends to carry the structural weakness of its foundation. Megan called me once, in April, and left a voicemail I listened to all the way through. She said she was sorry, and she said it like she meant it. I thought about calling back for 3 days. Then I thought about the Sunday they had appeared uninvited in my driveway, and about the text she had sent Daniel. She doesn't know anything. I did not call back, not because I was nursing a wound, but because some bridges can't be rebuilt from one end, and the choice was mine to make. The summer moved forward. The garden came in. The Foundation's programs reached 4,000 students in their first year. Gerald and I had dinner once, at a restaurant neither of us chose for strategic reasons, and it was easy in the way that things are easy when you are not performing for anyone. I turned 41 in August and had a small dinner party at the bungalow. Rachel, Dorothea, 2 colleagues from the Foundation board, and my mother, who drove up from Dayton and said the garden was beautiful and cried once, briefly in the kitchen when she thought I wasn't looking. I put my arm around her and we stood at the window and looked at the lavender. Was this happiness? I think it was. The real kind, not the performed kind, not the catalog version, but the kind that comes from having been tested and having held, what would you have done in my place? I genuinely want to know. Would you have settled quietly? Would you have let the grief swallow you? Or would you have signed up for the Thursday group and hired the attorney and planted the garden? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. And if this story stayed with you, share it. Someone out there is sitting in a parking lot right now, phone in hand, trying to figure out what comes next. Tell them. Something does. Thank you for being here.